we need to remember that in a Cold War, you have to recognize there is a fundamental choice between the systems that are hostile to freedom and the systems that protect it. That's the essence of the Cold War in both cases. If we forget our fundamental principles, which are about individual liberty, about constitutional government, about the rule of law, if we forget that those things are central to the way that our societies work, if we start to feel some kind of envy, oh, they're so good at industry, they're so good at manufacturing, maybe we should take a leaf out of their book. If we start thinking that we should copy the Chinese way, then we lose our own motivation for winning this Cold War.
Please give it up for Brian and Sir Niall.
Welcome.
It's good to be back in Vancouver.
Well, we're going to talk about your feelings about Canada and your experience as a Scot growing up with family members in this country and so on, but that's perhaps for a little later in our conversation. I'd like to start by talking about something you talked about in your book, Civilization, the West and the Rest. And in that book, you talk about the killer apps. You talk about 6 key institutions and ideas that arose principally in the West and gave us our current world historical dominance. And those 6 killer apps are competition, science, the rule of law, including private property or property rights, you know, David Hume, stability of property, its transference by consent, modern medicine, consumerism, and the work ethic. Out of these beliefs, institutions, and practices, we have had a disproportionate influence in shaping the world for the last few centuries. But you also think that the rest of the world has pretty effectively assimilated much of this, while the West has lost confidence in itself. The very society that produced these killer apps that made us a society to be emulated around the world, we're now not so sure that we're a good thing. Right? The West's advantage is therefore seeping away. Is this inevitable? Or can the West recover its intellectual and moral vigor? And what would it take to achieve that?
Well, that's a great question because it's very large in scope. It's really been my work for decades to answer the question, why did the West become so dominant? And to answer that question, you first have to reject erroneous theories for Western ascendancy. If you'd had a conversation about that subject 100 years ago, say it was 1925, many people would have argued that there was a racial explanation for Western ascendancy. They would have said that it's simply that white people from Northwestern Europe are superior to everybody else. 100 years ago, that idea was actually quite fashionable. Mm-hmm. It was a part and parcel of eugenics movements and very fashionable ideas of racial difference. What I wanted to show was that that's not right. That wasn't why people from Northwestern Europe became so dominant, beginning really in the 17th century and reaching an extraordinary culmination in the mid-20th century. The reason for Western ascendancy was in many ways a somewhat contingent confluence of ideas and institutions. And the key to understanding our time is that those ideas and institutions were open source. Anybody could download them. And beginning with the Japanese in the Meiji period, non-Western societies from the late 19th century through the 20th century and most decidedly in the 21st century, understood that if you imported these systems, these ideas and institutions, the notion of competition in economics and politics, the notion of the rule of law based on private property rights, the scientific revolution, modern medicine, which is really a kind of later offshoot of the scientific revolution, then this idea that a consumer society is a legitimate, desirable thing, and finally, the work ethic, which Max Weber associated with Protestantism. Again, wrong. The work ethic was not peculiar to Protestants. Like all the things I've described, these were open source innovations. They arose in Northwestern Europe. They began in places like England and Scotland. But gradually they spread because there was no real barrier to their adoption. So that's why it was inevitable that the rest of the world would close the gap. And there was nothing that we could possibly have done to stop that. Indeed, if you think about the ways of stopping it, the most drastic was warfare. One of the most ghastly conflicts of history was World War II, arguably the worst. I wrote about it in War of the World. And you could interpret that war, if you liked, as an attempt by the West to prevent Japan from taking its place in the First World. And so determined were we to stop that happening, so determined were we to prevent there being equality between Japan and the West, that we ended up dropping 2 atomic bombs on Japan. Did we succeed? No, because Japan bounced back despite the catastrophe of World War II and very rapidly closed the economic gap between itself and the West. Could we do better? This is the second part of the argument. Once I had written Civilization, I realized that there was an unanswered question. I'd explained why the rest could catch up, why all they had to do was copy these ideas and institutions. But what I hadn't explained was why the West was underperforming, why, in a sense, we were failing to maintain our 6 killer apps. And using, again, an analogy, it was as if there were bugs and malware getting into our operating system. And what were these? So in a book called The Great Degeneration, which was originally Reith Lectures for the BBC, I suggested that there were 4 things going wrong with Western societies. And these are not peculiar to the United States or the United Kingdom. You could find them in Canada. You could find them, indeed, in non-English speaking developed countries. Number 1, disastrous fiscal policies. Fiscal policies that created unsustainable debt burdens, representing a fundamental betrayal of the social contract between the generations. Number 2, the emergence of bureaucratic regulatory states, profoundly inimical to innovation and flourishing market economy. Number 3, the degeneration of the rule of law into the rule of lawyers, which is a different thing. And finally, and crucially, the destruction of our education institutions, partly through the excessive power of the state over those institutions. So those were the things that I saw going wrong with Western societies, making it easier for the rest to catch up, causing the gap to narrow more rapidly. This audience, I think, is relatively pessimistic about our ability to get the malware, to get the bugs out of our systems. I'm more optimistic, I suspect, than you in believing that these problems are fixable. I actually think the pathologies of Western societies are much more fixable than the pathologies of the totalitarian regimes like the People's Republic of China, which is our principal antagonist. So I think these problems are fixable, because they're not deeply innate to us, any more than the reasons for our success were deeply innate to us. The reasons that we're underperforming have to do with our ideas and institutions going somewhat off track, creating perverse incentives. If you can identify where the perverse incentives lie, they're fixable. Human nature responds to incentives. It's not deeply hardwired in our DNA to behave in these ways. There's nothing in our evolutionary biology that says you must have a public debt in excess of 100% of GDP and a welfare system that's completely fiscally unsustainable. That's not hardwired. That's a political option that we've chosen. And I think from that point of view, I'm relatively optimistic. The reasons for our success were somewhat contingent. They were not in the stars or in our DNA. And the reasons for our recent problems are equally fixable. They're equally the products of ideas and institutions.
Well, that sets us up beautifully for the next series of questions I have.
I also do short answers. And I can do the Douglas Murray, passionate stuff, but later.
We'll let you warm up a little bit first.
That was very professorial, wasn't it? It was like, Professor Ferguson will give you a lecture on the origins of Western ascendancy. Sorry.
This is why we brought you here.
This is why we brought you here,
Neil. So, but before we get to digging into each one of those things that you put on the table, the great degeneration, the failure of our institutions, our political discipline and so on, I want to make sure we get to a question that I know is in the minds of everybody in this room. As I'm sure you know, Canadians feel rather bruised and insulted by Donald Trump. And this has soured many of my countrymen on not just the president, but on our relationship with America. And my impression is that you do not share this assessment of either America or the current occupant of the White House. Don't want to put words in your mouth. What would you say to Canadians, first, to convince them that America is still the indispensable nation, if you agree with that? Or is it in terminal decline? And does it still retain its traditional capacity to reinvent itself, which is the thing I most admire about American society, its infinite ability to renew itself? And second, what would you say to Canadians that might get them to think afresh about Donald Trump? Is he a consequential president? Or someone we'll all be relieved to see in the rearview mirror? Or maybe both?
Well, this is one of these great opportunities that come my way occasionally, how to lose an audience completely.
I wanted to give it to you early on.
Say something positive about Donald Trump in Canada. And it's a suicide mission. Look, I think there's a great deal of nonsense written about President Trump. And this has been true for 10 years now, because he burst onto the scene. It's more than 10 years now since he announced he was going to run for president. And when people had stopped mocking him and began to realize that this was a serious proposition, a series of wild analogies began to be published regularly in the US liberal media, as well as in Europe and in Canada. And the analogies were with Hitler, with Mussolini, or with Roman emperors, the Julius Caesar, Augustus analogies. And I have spent a decade saying how absurd these analogies are and unnecessary. They're superfluous. They're category errors. It's a category error to draw a comparison between the United States in our time and Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. It's just a fundamental misreading of history. Donald Trump is a very United States figure. He comes out of an American tradition. You can see the influences from the 19th century and the 1970s in Trump. The way I try to explain this to skeptical British and European audiences is he's like a combination of Andrew Jackson, William McKinley, P.T. Barnum, and Richard Nixon. If you imagine all of those distinctly American figures combined into one person, you have Donald Trump. So that the first thing to understand is he's quintessentially a product of the American populist tradition, and he's only puzzling if you don't know any 19th century American history. If you don't know any 19th century US history, good luck. But if you know some, you'll know that tariffs were central to American politics in the 19th century. You'll know that the debates on immigration produced restrictive acts beginning in 1882 to limit immigration into the United States. You will know that cheap money and skepticism about central banks was rooted in that populist tradition. You'll see how very, very American he is. And we don't need to invoke fascists or Roman emperors to understand him. It's just superfluous. The next thing you have to understand is that you couldn't go on the way the United States was going on in the period from around 2000. It was unsustainable in at least two ways. Number one, the decision to admit China into the World Trade Organization and allow China to hollow out North American manufacturing by not holding China to its World Trade Organization commitments was a disaster for every American except the 0.1% who massively profited from what I call Chimerica. The median household saw its income in the United States stagnate. It did not move from 1999 until 2016, flatlined. That wasn't sustainable. Nor was it sustainable for the United States to deploy armies to places as far afield and intractable as Iraq and Afghanistan for what seemed like indefinite periods of time. These two things, globalization and the neoconservative vision of foreign policy, were broken and no longer economically or politically viable by the year 2016. The only surprising thing to me when I moved to the United States, which was way back in 2002, was the lack of protectionist candidates in American politics. I kept asking my colleagues at NYU and then at Harvard, where are the protectionists? It's like, this is like a no-brainer. There were none, because the Republicans and Democrats had decided that Chimerica was win-win. Except the only people who weren't winning were American voters. It took Donald Trump to challenge the consensus on China and globalization, to challenge the consensus on immigration, which was essentially let them all come, to challenge the consensus on foreign policy. So if you think there was some way of stopping Donald Trump, you have to really work hard to explain to me why he got elected twice, and why the second time he got elected by a bigger margin than the first time. Because Americans, they decided maybe we made a mistake, so let's try to see if the Democrats have got anything. We'll give them another chance. So they did, and we had the Biden-Harris autopen presidency, which proceeded to fail in every respect. Economically, inflation hit 9%. On migration, they had an open borders policy. 2.3 million people a year entered the United States, mostly illegally, on Joe Biden's watch. And foreign policy was like a sort of sequence of failures of deterrence of extraordinary incompetence. Afghanistan, then the failure to deter Putin, then the failure to deter Iran that produced October 7th. And so American voters, not unreasonably, given the choice between more of that with Kamala Harris or a second Trump term, voted for Trump. So this is not so surprising. Did Canada feature in American thinking in any of this? No. Nobody thought about Canada anymore.
You shock me.
I know, I'm the bearer of bad news, but nor did anybody in England give a damn about what the Scots thought in 2016 when they voted overwhelmingly for Brexit. Scots didn't. Scots voted to stay in the EU. But you matter as much to Americans as we Scots matter to the English, which is not much. Not much. So the only moment when Canada mattered, really in the last 10 years, was when Justin Trudeau went to Mar-a-Lago to see Donald Trump, and Trump trolled him at dinner. Why did you could be the governor? And we did this. You could be the governor. My tie's not quite long enough.
And your socks are the wrong color.
You could be the governor of the 51st state, Justin. How about that?
And Trudeau is like completely falls right into the trap. Everybody's laughing because it's obviously a joke, but he kind of falls into the trap, and then you all fall into the trap. And Trump, who has an unerring instinct for human weakness, it's like his superpower is he can tell the weakness of the counterpart. It's like, I have got them, so I'm just going to pile on. I'm going to make this 51st state thing seem like I mean it. And you take the bait. And then, of course, because he's Trump, he doesn't think about the second-order consequences of what he's doing. Because I don't think anybody in Mar-a-Lago is like thinking, this could have an effect on the Canadian election. Has anybody run this past Pierre Poilievre? No, nobody had run it past anybody. The whole thing was completely impromptu. And you end up with Mark Carney as Prime Minister, because the only law of history is the law of unintended consequences. That is what happened. Americans got what they wanted, which was to end all the pathologies that I described to you, and you ended up with Mark Carney as Prime Minister. Funny world, isn't it?
Okay, let's move on from Donald Trump, although I'm sure we'll come back to him. I'm sure we'll come back to him because he's rather unavoidable.
You can't get away from him.
Yeah.
I think we did quite well not to mention him in the first question.
Yes, but I wasn't going to let you get away with it. We'll come back to that. The future of the West and the Western-driven world isn't only in the hands of the West in general and the hands of America in particular. The challenge isn't only the West's self-doubt, but the emergence of a competing coalition of powers that threaten the West both geopolitically and ideologically. How do you counsel the West to respond to the threats posed by what you call, he's a brilliant inventor of phrases, ladies and gentlemen, what he calls the axis of ill will, not the axis of evil, the axis of ill will. Russia, China, Iran, possibly North Korea. What's the response?
Back in 2018, I said, we're in Cold War II, we just haven't noticed. And the response of most people at that time was skepticism. I think I first threw this out at a lunch in San Francisco. Eric Schmidt was present. He was, I think it's fair to say, shocked. And so the initial reaction to my observation that we were in Cold War II was incredulity. Then, about a month or two later, I was at a conference in Italy, and I made a similar argument. My argument was, we had a very nice interwar period from 1991 till about maybe 2012, when Xi Jinping came to power in China. In that interwar period, we got to cut our defense budgets, pay ourselves a peace dividend. It was good. Everybody had a good time. But it's over. And it's over because although we thought history had ended in 1989, it had only ended in Berlin. It had ended in Eastern Europe, but not in Tiananmen Square. There was still a Marxist-Leninist party in charge of, at that time, roughly a fifth of humanity. So it was a little premature to declare victory. China's rise was at first regarded as something from which the West could benefit, hence Chimerica. But after a certain point, once China's GDP was perhaps 2/3 that of the United States on a current dollar basis, it ceased to be win-win and became a meaningful challenge. And I think that that's something that the Chinese understood, but we did not. So the argument that we were in Cold War II took a while to sink in, but that didn't surprise me. Because when Winston Churchill, who's represented on your tie, I am delighted to see, you may not see it, but I think he has the best tie of
a
the
tie
evening.
for every occasion, ladies and gentlemen.
So Churchill, when he gives the famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, is roundly condemned in the US press. The New York Times calls it warmongering because Churchill was very ahead of the curve to see that we were heading into Cold War. George Orwell called it in 1945. He coined the expression Cold War almost within days of the dropping of the atomic bombs. But most Americans didn't realize they were in Cold War until about 1950 when the Korean War broke out. In the same way, I don't think many people really got what I was talking about until Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022 with the obvious support of China. And as that war has gone on, and we're now approaching its 4th anniversary, what has been obvious? That Russia has had support not only from China, but also from Iran, and the North Koreans even sent troops. So if you were skeptical in 2018, it's got a lot harder to be skeptical about this argument. There is an axis. It exists. They meet regularly. They were getting together in Beijing for the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II. And they cooperate economically and militarily. What should we do? Well, I mean, we have a playbook from the first Cold War of what we should do. We should be extremely effective in deterring them from further acts of aggression. Unfortunately, the Biden team had forgotten every lesson of Cold War I with respect to deterrence. They allowed themselves to be intimidated by Putin, who began to talk about nuclear weapons very early on in the Ukraine war. They'd forgotten that when one power starts talking about nuclear weapons, you have to show that you're willing to use them too. Otherwise, you essentially cede escalation dominance to them. That's what we did. So rule number 1 of Cold War is reestablish deterrence. Do not be intimidated by those who rattle their nuclear sabers. And rule number 2, you have to make sure that your technological advantage does not leach away. We spent a lot of time in Cold War I on export controls, trying to make sure that the Soviets could not access the technologies, particularly computer technology, that the United States was pioneering. But we have to do the same now. This is particularly important as the artificial intelligence race reaches a kind of crescendo and at this early stage of the quantum race. And finally, and I think most importantly, we need to remember that in a Cold War, you have to recognize there is a fundamental choice between the systems that are hostile to freedom and the systems that protect it. That's the essence of the Cold War in both cases. If we forget our fundamental principles, which are about individual liberty, about constitutional government, about the rule of law, if we forget that those things are central to the way that our societies work, if we start to feel some kind of envy, oh, they're so good at industry, they're so good at manufacturing, maybe we should take a leaf out of their book. If we start thinking that we should copy the Chinese way, then we lose our own motivation for winning this Cold War. So those, I think, are very obvious lessons of Cold War I. We established deterrence, that was the essence of containment, and we avoided World War III, which is clearly pretty crucial. We also managed to maintain a technological lead. If you don't believe me, read Chris Miller's brilliant book, Chip War. And we retained, even at the most difficult times, the height of the Vietnam War, we maintained a fundamental belief that we stood for freedom and they did not. And even if people on the left lost sight of it in the late 60s and 70s, there was Alexander Solzhenitsyn to remind them of the difference between the free world and the unfree world. So in a sense, it's the same problem with just one very fundamental complication. Unlike in Cold War I, we are intimately economically linked to the People's Republic of China. Chimerica hasn't died. Decoupling is something that you can say that you want to do, but it's hard to do. Try it. Try decoupling when your supply chains are entirely bound up with China's vast manufacturing capability. We didn't have that problem in Cold War I. It makes Cold War II much harder for us to win. I don't think people are nearly worried enough. This is the last thing I'm going to say. People are not nearly worried enough about losing Cold War II. They just don't worry enough about what the world would be like if the authoritarians won. Now, people in Ukraine understand that. When I go to Kyiv, I have no trouble understanding what's at stake here because people talk about the way the Russians treat people in the territories that they occupy, which is utterly barbaric. But we in North America, I say we, I'm an American citizen now, we have great difficulty imagining defeat. We have great difficulty imagining a world in which China is the dominant power and has dominance through all the technological channels that now exist. This is a kind of leap of imagination that I find it hard to get even well-educated audiences like this to make. Imagine a world in which they win and we lose. And freedom is gone because the surveillance state is then a global enterprise and there is nowhere to hide. And your thoughts, which you've already expressed in digital form multiple times, can be accessed by the CCP, and a global social credit system can be introduced, ensuring that anybody who is guilty of wrongthink is punished. That's the future that would lie ahead of us if we lost this second Cold War.
Well, thanks for that optimistic view.
I'm merely telling you why we should not lose it.
I completely agree. Now, we've talked quite a lot about the danger to the West, not here so much, but we hear a lot of talk about the danger to the West posed by our self-doubt and even our self-loathing. And I wonder how you explain to yourself that the most successful and powerful culture, society, economy, and military power in the world, in world history, has, at least in the minds of its intelligentsia, become a byword for all that's retrograde and shameful. Racism, sexism, colonialism, imperialism, oppression, exploitation. What's the process by which we arrived here in a period of great iconoclasm? And a supplementary question, to what extent are the West's adversaries, of whom we spoke a moment ago, complicit in the destruction of the West's moral self-confidence? Will they succeed in overwhelming us, not by defeating us militarily, but by using social media and other communications techniques to so sap our beliefs in ourselves to such an extent that we cease to believe that what we have achieved is worth defending?
Well, I think it is the hallmark of a free society that it can question itself. I actually think self-doubt and self-criticism are fundamental parts of a successful free society. One of the things that has been a distinctive and I think attractive feature of the United States throughout its history has been the capacity of Americans to worry about their own system and to criticize it for its failings. And we shouldn't repudiate that tradition. When Franklin said to the lady in Philadelphia, "A republic if you can keep it," I think the only way you keep a republic is by constantly worrying that it's either descending into anarchy or it's descending into monarchy and tyranny. And what's reassuring to me is that for nearly 250 years, Americans have been worrying about that kind of thing. Now, when it tips over into self-loathing, to use your term, it seems to me we have to look at educational institutions for an explanation. Ordinary Americans don't hate America. They have considerable mistrust of their own institutions, much more than they had 50 years ago. But they don't hate America. The people who hate America are professors. The agenda of hating the West can be traced to the educational institutions. And I think what happened was that the Marxists, having lost the Cold War in the realm of economics and geopolitics, staged a brilliant tactical retreat into the educational institutions and decided to make cultural war because class war had failed. And instead of ordering the world on the basis of Marx's social framework, they adopted instead an identity-based concept of intersectionality, of identity. This project was, I think, already incipient in the 1980s, but it took time for the takeover to be achieved because academic time is much slower than normal time because of tenure and longevity. And so it takes a while for the classical liberals, the liberals of the 1960s, to die off. And before they die, what do? Well, they hire people who are to the left of them because they have a kind of bad conscience, or maybe they still remember their happy days protesting in 1968, but they basically hire people to the left of them. And these people who call themselves progressives, they too have careers, and in the course of their careers, they hire people to the left of them. And so we go from the liberals of Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s generation in two stages to the sort of Zoran Mamdani generation of full-blown socialists committed to illiberalism, opposed to free speech, committed against liberty, and determined to politicize the academy by driving out anyone who dissents. So the left's move in the academy really was a kind of two-pronged attack. First, the attack on academic freedom, the attack on free speech on campus, and then the attack on meritocracy, so that you simultaneously got rid of academic freedom by making it genuinely more dangerous to speak freely on an American campus than in any other institution in America. By the way, in parenthesis, I would not have become an academic if I had thought for 5 seconds that there would be this extraordinary phenomenon of totalitarian behavior on American campuses. I thought by becoming an academic, I was guaranteed more liberty than in any other possible profession. I knew the money would be rubbish, especially in England, but I thought no one's ever going to be able to tell me what to say. No boss. There's no such thing as a boss at Oxford or Cambridge. That's why I became an academic, because I love liberty more than money, more than anything. I really love liberty. That's why I get on so well with Javier Milei. It's just like, we love it, you know? That's what motivates us. Viva la libertad, carajo. That's me. So I become an academic, and then I'm completely, it's like bait and switch. There am I, minding my own business on the Harvard campus, teaching Western ascendancy, when I start to encounter for the first time cancel culture. It's about 2014. We enter the world of disinvitation and deplatforming. I'm like, hang on a minute, this is not what I signed up for. There's been some kind of mistake. If you had told me when I was an undergraduate that the kind of behavior that went on in the Soviet Union in the 1930s and also in Germany in the 1930s or in China in the 1960s, denunciations, cancellations, the erasure of people for their views. If you told me those behaviors could happen in a free society without a dictatorship and that they would flourish in universities, if you told me that in the 1980s, I would not have believed you. And if I had believed you, I would certainly not have become an academic. So this is the extraordinary thing that happened. And it was imperceptible right through the 2010s when it was happening. Colleagues at universities like Harvard, where I work, refused to believe that it was relevant to them. Because first they came for the conservatives. But the kind of liberals never thought they would come for the liberals until they did. So I think the conceit that the history of the world is a history of oppression, of victims and oppressors, that Western ascendancy is explicable in terms of empire, only empire, that empire is entirely and unequivocally evil, and that the only way forward is to redress the wrongs by creating a kind of reverse imperialism where victims become oppressors and oppressors become victims. That whole way of thinking about the world, sort of Foucault meets Edward Said, it emanates from the universities and it spreads like some mind virus. It was Richard Dawkins who I think first used that term, throughout society. It was Andrew Sullivan who said, we all live on campus now. I think he said that nearly 10 years ago. It spreads out. It spreads into the media. It spreads into the tech companies. Soon it's everywhere because an entire generation has been given these ideas, not only at university, but also increasingly in high school. So that's what we did. Do I think I could have done more to stop it? Well, I tried. I spent a lot of my life losing votes on committees and at faculty meetings trying to stop this from happening. And I finally realized that it could not be stopped and that the established institutions were entirely infected by the mind virus. That was what motivated me to start a new university, that belief that we could not fix the established institutions. But it took me a long time to give up. It took me years to accept that you couldn't turn it around at Harvard or at Stanford.
Well, now I've managed to get you exactly where I want you, because I wanted to talk now about the University of Austin in Texas. Many people in this audience may not know that you are a co-founder of this new university, and despite your appointment at some of the world's most prestigious universities, you are well known for arguing the case that you just made, that there's an intellectual and moral rot that is assailing our universities. And I want to get you to talk about the University of Austin, what you were trying to achieve, but I wanted to start by saying I went on the University of Austin website and I clicked on their statement on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Have you done this? Have you been on the website?
I very much hope that I signed off on it.
I liked it so much that I printed it out, and I have it here. The most famous passage in the statement goes like this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What have America's founders to teach us about the true meaning of diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, yes, I'm happy about our decision to use the Declaration of Independence as our DEI statement. It's part of a conscious modeling of the university on the founding principles of the United States. Unlike other universities, the University of Austin has a constitution, and I should know because I wrote it. And as I set myself the task of writing a constitution, my motivation was the belief that what I just described to you that happened in the universities happened because of a problem of governance. There were no real checks and balances to stop the tenured faculty going batshit crazy or the president, the provost going batshit crazy. When those things happened, and they've happened at universities in Canada, in fact, some of the leading dissidents in the academic world are Canadians. Think of Jordan Peterson, or Gad Saad. I mean, they experienced this, if anything, somewhat earlier than people in the US. So my observation was that if this could happen in all of these different universities, regardless of their histories and traditions and their systems of governance, there must be a general problem of governance. And my observation was that no university had a judicial branch. They might have a legislative branch, which was usually the tenured faculty. They certainly had an executive branch, which would be the president and the provost. But there was no judicial branch to say, hey, stop, you can't do that. So we drew up a constitution that was consciously modeled on the US Constitution. I actually began copying and pasting the parts of the US Constitution that seemed to me relevant to a new academic institution. And I think that's the only way forward, by having an explicit constitutional set of rights, including academic freedom and a commitment to make all our decisions purely on the basis of academic excellence, not on the basis of religion or race or sex or anything else, purely on the basis of academic. By having that in a Bill of Rights, it's enforceable. If somebody starts to deviate from that commitment, they can end up with the adjudicative panel, which Robbie George chairs, ruling against them, even if it's the president. So I think we've been very innovative in the realm of governance, and it worked. As soon as we created the Constitution, there were actually 2 cases that went to the adjudicative panel, 2 cases that the university leadership lost. So I think we've done something very important there. But the more important thing that we've done, and you'll appreciate this as a founder, because you're a founder, this is a new institution that we're here involved with. If you create a new institution, you don't really know if it's going to work. That's why being a founder is just harder than turning up at an established institution. I did not know 4 years ago when we had the idea of launching a new university, if the young people who came to it would actually want freedom. I mean, what if we had built a university committed to free speech and Gen Z turned up and immediately started canceling one another and policing speech? What if it was a generational problem and not an institutional problem? Well, it turned out not to be a generational problem, because almost immediately, the students that we attracted showed themselves to be committed to the ideas of academic freedom and the principles of meritocracy. It was really inspiring. And indeed, whenever my battery needs recharged, I go to Austin and I hang out with the students. It's still a small number of people. We've 2 classes, each fewer than 100. But those students are the most inspiring people in my world because they love the freedom. We have some simple rules. No devices in the classroom. And Chatham House rule. What is said in the classroom cannot be attributed outside the classroom to the person who said it. You can say what was said, but you can't say, oh, it was Ferguson who said that outrageous thing, let's put it on social media. That's not allowed. So by creating meaningful rules that allow free speech, we created an opportunity for 20-year-old young Americans to say what they thought. I don't know how many of you are Beethoven fans. Who knows the opera Fidelio? Okay. So the rest of you, can you go and do a little bit of music? I mean, because that's not good. You should all know Fidelio. It's one of the greatest works that Western civilization ever produced. Beethoven's only opera, and you don't know it? Well, to the educated minority, I'll remind you, the moment when the prisoners are let out of the prison and they sing this extraordinary chorus to be able to breathe in the free air, in the open air. It's extraordinarily moving. That's what we discovered, that we had created a Fidelio moment for Gen Z. And it's so reassuring, it's so uplifting that they seized it and within a very short space of time created their own debating society, the Austin Union, which is already a massive improvement on the Oxford Union, which of course has gone woke. So I think we're doing something incredibly important. It's small, but everything is small at first. That's why I remind people. They say, oh, how many students do you have? And I say, well, fewer than 200. And they go, huh. I said, you know what? Harvard used to have fewer than 200. Guess what? So did Oxford. Everything is a startup at the beginning. But if you do it with enough conviction, and if you design it well enough, then one day your startup will be, as I believe the University of Austin will be, the equal of Harvard and indeed of Oxford. So that's the dream. And I don't believe that I could have done it anywhere else. You couldn't start a new university in England. The Guardian would just kill you. Be like, they would just dismiss it. Tory plot. Evil Tory university. That was what they would do. They would just be dead on arrival. But you can do it in the United States. I don't know whether you could do it in Canada, but at least you've been able to create a new think tank here.
Yes, and very successful too, if I do say so myself.
So it seems.
So you said something just a moment ago about the University of Boston, which I think we should explore just for a second, because I think the audience will find it quite interesting. You talked about the students not having access to their devices while they're at the university. And I want to read to our audience something that you wrote just very recently, I think in the Free Press. I see very little prospect of such a radical new regime being adopted at any of the established universities, as they are by definition universities of the past. I put this in italics in my notes here. However, I shall be arguing strongly that we take this position at the University of Boston. Strict prohibitions on devices within the cloister, including wearable and implanted technology, will have to be insisted upon if the rapid advance, listen to this, if the rapid advance of pseudo-intelligence is not to plunge all of humanity into a new dark age. What do you mean?
Well, first, who here has read any novel by Neil Stephenson?
Got a few over here.
I've got 3. I'm disappointed.
Did he write any authors?
Very disappointed. So here's the second assignment. You've got to listen to Fidelio. You've got to start reading some Neil Stephenson. Neil Stephenson is the great science fiction author of this generation. He saw the metaverse coming. That's in Snow Crash. Crypto, Cryptonomicon. And AI is in The Diamond Age, which I think is his best book. A wonderful book, which entirely visualizes a world in which there will be ubiquitous, accessible, adaptable information, organized by pseudo-intelligence. The joke that he makes early on is, we call it PI. And PI is better than AI, because the intelligence that we're talking about here is pseudo-intelligence. It is simulated human intelligence that large language models give you. It's not quite right to call it artificial. So Stevenson's concept of pseudo-intelligence is a brilliant one. I've also called it inhuman intelligence, because I think one wants to convey that AI is an alien form of intelligence, quite different from the way that our brains work. My view is that AI has the potential to transform, in particular, medical science and probably science more broadly, and that the most important innovation of the last 5 years was, in fact, AlphaFold. That Demis Hassabis and DeepMind are the real revolutionaries, and Sam Altman and ChatGPT are the dark side. It's a very dark thing, what ChatGPT is doing, because what's happened, particularly in the realm of education, is that within a very short space of time, it was measurable in months, almost every undergraduate started using ChatGPT to do their assignments. Because all take-home assignments can be written by a large language model. And the LLM allows you to cut out the reading, because it'll summarize the readings for you. It will cut out the thinking, because it will give you an essay plan. And it will cut out the writing, because it will write it for you. And it will do all this astonishingly rapidly. What is amazing to me, Brian, I mean, truly amazing, is that this all happened extraordinarily fast, within months of the release of ChatGPT. It's downloaded and used by undergraduates before any other group. Usage diminishes in the summer. Funny that. And the universities still, in late 2025, do not have a coherent policy. Stanford, which you would have thought would be at the forefront, has no policy. And as a result, most assignments are written by OpenAI, and students are learning almost nothing. It takes a new university to say, well, we can't allow that. That's the opposite of learning. That is actually going to do significant damage to the cognitive development of a generation. And therefore, we need to create the cloister. And my idea, which was set out in an essay, originally a talk at the University of Austin, is that we need a cloister and a starship. We can't stop the students using AI when they're not in the cloister. But when they're in the cloister, they can't use it. They have to learn the old ways, or their brains will simply be deformed. So the goal here is to allow a system of assessment and of learning to exist, to survive in the now hostile environment created by large language models. And all our testing will be done in class, orally or with written blue book examinations. There's no other way. If you don't do that, then everyone will cheat because incentives. I mean, wouldn't you, if you were an undergraduate, be tempted? I used to have to sit up all night in Oxford to write essays when I fell behind because I was too busy partying like all normal 18-year-olds at college. If ChatGPT had existed in 1983, would I have resisted the temptation? Hell no. So we have to recognize that students are being subjected to vast temptations. Jonathan Haidt has been very good on the negative impact on a generation of smartphones and social media. But I said to him, the next book you write will be far more devastating. It will be about the catastrophe inflicted on a generation by ChatGPT, which has essentially short-circuited all of our educational methods. You ask any university that you're involved with, what is your policy? Is there a restriction on the use of large language models? Are you still allowing students to take home assignments and send in via email or over some app word-processed essays? And if the answer is, yeah, we allow all that, then the university should just shut down. It's no longer performing any legitimate educational purpose. And we need to do something about this.
Well, now, Neil, you're famously a historian, and if I understand you correctly, you think that people are not mere playthings of impersonal historical forces that grind on regardless of our efforts and our intentions. You think we can make a difference. And moreover, you think that free, innovative societies can win out over the autocrats. Not will, but can win out. Are you optimistic that the West will rise to this challenge? And do you see, in the context of your answer of just a moment ago, do you see a particular challenge in getting the young to rise up in defense of societies that they have been taught are morally bankrupt and even reprehensible? And when the president of the Oxford Union celebrates the assassination of Charlie Kirk, is there hope?
Let's not dwell on the abject decline of the Oxford Union. Let's focus on what is, I think, encouraging. My sense is that if you create the right environments, as I think we have done at the University of Austin, young people want freedom. Because in the end, cheating your way through 4 years of college doesn't feel good. And you have to know that the imposter syndrome is gonna burn the minute you leave these institutions. And you'll get found out. It only needs a very small cohort of University of Austin graduates to be in the labor market for all the bluffers from the Ivy Leagues to be roadkill. And this is gonna move things fast. Let me tell you two important things that I have learned. It doesn't take a vast number of institutions and people to achieve change. A paper that my young, brilliant colleague Manny Rincon-Cruz wrote at Hoover a couple of years ago revealed that the leftward turn of the historical profession in the United States was largely the achievement of a small number of individuals at a small number of departments. There was one professor at Madison, Wisconsin, who had 99 doctoral students in his career, which, trust me, is like superhuman. And of those 99, nearly all of them went on to become professors. And so we were able to show with a network analysis that this one institution, the Department of History at Madison, Wisconsin, had populated most other research universities with professors in a 30 to 40 year period. So you can explain the leftward drift by looking at the impact of a relatively small number of institutions. Well, that tells you that we can achieve the opposite with a relatively small number of institutions because of network effects. If we produce enough good people, then we can actually turn the tide. That, to me, is tremendously important insight of the historical process. The book I wrote about networks, The Square and the Tower, shows that small but dynamic networks can be revolutionary. The American Revolution, the 250th anniversary of which we're about to celebrate, is the work of a relatively small number of people who are in a social network that is able to overthrow an empire. So that's the first piece of good news. Second piece of good news is that after a certain point, when things really suck, then even young people can see the beauty of liberty. And this brings me to Argentina. I don't know how many of you have been to Buenos Aires, a remarkable city. 120 years ago, on a par economically with Canada. For most of my lifetime, I byword for economic failure. I used to joke in my financial history course at Harvard that all financial crises have happened in Argentina at least twice. And so you can actually do all of financial history just with Argentina. It's all there. But Argentina is going through a libertarian revolution under the leadership of Javier Milei. And I learned when I sat down with him in the summer, the key to the success of this. He himself would fit right in here. He's a real intellectual, deeply committed to libertarian ideas, would get on like a house on fire with you as a fan of Hayek. But in addition to being a committed libertarian, Milei knows how to get young people excited about freedom. If you look at the campaign that he just ran, which won the midterm elections in Argentina, his campaign events are basically rock and roll. I mean, he is like the rock and roll libertarian. I know he looks like he's in a kind of aging late 60s rock band that just reformed for one final tour. It's like the hair. I grew my sideburns a little longer to celebrate Milei's success. But I mean, his are magnificent examples of the genre. But these rallies where he kind of goes on stage to rock music, dancing in his leather jacket, they work. He's mobilized young Argentinians against what he calls la casta, the corrupt system of Peronist politicians and corrupt businessmen and trade union leaders and all the other parasites who've been leeching off the Argentine economy for decades. And he has mobilized young people against that. So it's doable. It's doable. But our politicians on the right have to learn from Milei. You can't mobilize young voters, or for that matter, older voters, by simply going through the tarred, tried and tested techniques of the campaigns of the 1980s and 1990s. We're in the 2020s. Those techniques no longer work. You need a social media game. Milei is very good at that. But you also need a stage show. So I'm an optimist because I think liberty's great. I think it's especially appealing to young people. Young people have false consciousness, to use a phrase from the left, because of their education. They don't understand that the welfare state is a system of transferring resources from young people to older people. And so they don't understand that the left is playing them. They are being played by the left. And until a politician explains that to them, you are the suckers. You are the marks. You're going to spend your working lives paying huge tax bills in order to support these anachronistic welfare states, which are survivals from the 1960s. Until we learn how to make that case, we'll keep losing. So I think it's actually doable. It's doable.
I've only got time for one more question, and then Peter's going to come and elbow me out of the way.
I know there are people in the audience with questions.
Oh yes, that's next. But I have one more question, which is designed to get you to talk a little bit about yourself. I think I'm right in saying that in your book, Empire, I brought my copy and got Niall to sign it. You talk about growing up in Scotland, where because of empire and its lingering shadow, everyone had a relative in Canada, including you. You had relatives in Saskatchewan, relatives in Don Mills. Has being a Scot shaped your worldview and how you think about history?
Yes. And because I want to get onto the audience questions, I'll keep it real short. All the best ideas were had in Scotland.
All the Scottish Enlightenment.
And they were all those best ideas were had in the late 18th century by a relatively small number of Scotsmen: Adam Ferguson, Adam Smith, David Hume. Those were the best ideas. All subsequent ideas are worse and should largely be rejected. I have been steered by the ideas of the Scottish Enlightenment since I was an undergraduate and realized that they were the key to organizing a free society, to having a free market, but also to having a society based on, as Smith said, the moral sentiments. It's all there, and in that sense, I'm deeply influenced by my Scottish roots. That book has a subtitle, has various subtitles. One of them was How Britain Made the Modern World, but it's really about how the Scots made the modern world, because the English largely stayed at home on their country estates, enjoying life. And it was the Scots who actually had to go and do the heavy lifting of making the modern world. And we did a pretty good job.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know that you all have your questions for Niall, and I think we have a little time for that, maybe 15 minutes or so, Peter. But we have mics in the room, and I would ask you to put your hands up, please. And I will take questions, Niall, if you are okay with it, three at a time.
Sure.
So that we get through as many questioners as we can. Okay. So make notes about the questions that are asked, and you can say whatever you want in response to the three questions, then we'll move on to the next set of three. Okay. Gentleman here in the white jacket. Identify yourself.
Sure. My name is Adam Zivo. I'm the National Post de facto Ukraine correspondent, and I've spent most of the past 3 years living in Odessa. You speak about the importance of taking the Second Cold War very seriously, and give a lot of well-justified criticism towards the Biden administration. But what do you make of the Trump administration's attempts to establish some kind of rapprochement with Moscow, particularly its recent attempts to force Kyiv to sign what is essentially a capitulation agreement in exchange for investment opportunities in Russia?
Thanks, Adam. There was somebody over here. This gentleman here right in the front row, please. Identify yourself. Brief question, please.
Thank you. My name is Michael Stephen. I wonder, Niall, could you please talk a bit more about AI in government, in industry? You're in Austin, where Tesla is having its robotaxis. There'll be robotic workers in factories, on the farms, and the loss of income for people in the future.
Carl, did you have your hand up? Carl, didn't know? Okay, way in the back, that gentleman right there, who's standing up.
Hi, my name is Ryle. I was wondering if you could comment on the West, the post-Christian and post-liberal kind of milieu that we're in. but specifically commenting on the end of sectarianism, if there's any influence or relation in that. Thanks.
Neil.
I think, with all due respect to you as a journalist, Adam, I have rarely seen the world's media cover a story more ineptly than they have covered the recent US peace initiative in the war between Ukraine and Russia. It has been a travesty of bad reporting and opinion writing disguised as reporting. It is not the case that the 28-point plan is a Russian-authored document of capitulation. You only need to read it to see that it contains significant shifts in the Russian position. It allows Ukraine a US security guarantee that is, quote, NATO-like. It envisions using the frozen assets for the reconstruction of Ukraine, which is in itself a remarkable shift, and it contemplates a peacetime Ukrainian army of 600,000, which is 10 times the size of the British army. I could go on. Those who criticize the attempt to make peace, it seems to me, are imagining fondly that Ukraine can win this war. But you know, because you've been in Ukraine, that that is a highly unlikely scenario at this point. If there was a chance for Ukraine to win the war, it was in late 2022. In a 4-year war, there is no way that Ukraine, with its resources and its population, defeats Russia, a vastly larger country, which also has the backing of China, as I mentioned earlier. Any peace is therefore bound to be a compromise peace. The choice for Ukraine is between a compromise peace or defeat. Ukraine is in a political crisis at the moment, you know that, and it is in a military crisis because it's simply going to run out of men. It cannot match Russia when it comes to raising the armies for the war in 2026. So I find the way the press is covering this grossly irresponsible, implying that there is some path to victory that Ukraine has open to it. It's extraordinarily feckless to make that argument when it's so clearly not the case. I feel strongly about this. I think the press has been particularly reprehensible in the way that it's characterized the motives of Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. But of course, they disparaged Jared Kushner in the first Trump administration when he embarked on the path that led to the Abraham Accords. So I don't believe the journalists who trash him now, because they were wrong then, and they'll be wrong again. The impact of artificial intelligence on the economy, Michael, is one of the hardest questions that an economic historian can address, because we're predisposed to assume that all technological innovation will produce new employment rather than unemployment. That's been the historical experience ever since the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution. On the other hand, this is a technological innovation very different from the advent of mechanized manufacturing. And so I'm somewhat nervous about at least the short-run impact on white-collar employment, which looks like it could be really huge. And my assumption is that whatever may happen in the long run, in the short run, we're going to have an AI shock comparable with the China shock. Only this time, white-collar workers will be most impacted. And we can already see it happening in the hiring of the big tech companies, which is way down, as well as the impacts in law firms and financial services. So I think a big dislocation in the Western labor market, indeed in the global labor market, is already underway. And that is going to have all kinds of unforeseeable social and political consequences. I think it was Ryan who asked about sectarianism in a post-Christian world. My argument in response to some of John Haight's recent writing is that the reason young people are highly susceptible to the addictive properties of smartphones and social media is that they've kind of been made ready for this assault by the process of secularization. Secularization is one of these things that sounds benign, but actually the decline of Christianity in the Western world has had all kinds of very adverse consequences. A very striking finding in Haight's most recent writing is that young people from Christian, or I should say religious, because this is also true of Jewish families, conservative families, are much less susceptible to the mental health problems that young people from liberal secular families experience. That's telling. Now, I wouldn't want to defend sectarianism. I grew up in Glasgow, which is a kind of capital of sectarianism, rivaled only by Belfast. And I think one reason my parents left the Church of Scotland was to get away from the sectarianism that pitted Protestants against Catholics. But I found in the end that atheism was not a basis for a meaningful life, and certainly not for a happy family life. And so I and my wife recently were baptized and are now practicing and devout Christians. And it has made a profound change to my life. So I have a view, which is that we're probably in the very early phase of a Christian revival. And this reawakening will be the antidote to the great awakening that has caused so much harm. I very much hope that will be the case. I look around me in England, where I'm spending a lot of time, and I think how many unhappy people there are who would be so much happier if they only went to church on a Sunday and opened their hearts to Christ. It's that simple.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to take 3 more questions, and so 15 seconds for your question.
30
Neil,
seconds for my answer.
A minute, perhaps, for your answer. The lady there, about 3 rows in from the back. Yes, that's you. You're standing up. That's good.
Hi, Leah. Nice to see you again. My question is that you had said that there was an opportunity that we had to write things, go back to the foundations of the killer apps. However, I was wondering if you could give us examples from history where people have, or countries have successfully done that, because it strikes me that usually we wait till we completely crash and burn, and we don't take that opportunity. So I'd love to know a real-life historical example when we actually have righted the ship.
Thank you. And Leah, it's lovely to see you here
Very
today.
good to see
We're
you again.
so happy to see you. Thank you. This young man with the hand up, yes? 15 seconds, identify yourself.
Hi, I'm Maximus. I'm 14. I just wanted to, say, unfortunately, your generation has made quite the mess for mine and its ascent to power to clean up after you. So, I just wanted to ask, and sorry, it's a vague question, but just see where you're going to bring this, and any advice you have for someone like me who's interested in being here as I am, just where to bring that and how I should work on the world.
Lovely. All right, I'm sure we'll have an answer to that. And gentleman right in the front row here for the last question. Identify yourself, 15 seconds.
Hi, I'm Jens Zimmerman, a professor at University of British Columbia. Let me know if your university is hiring. I'd be interested. Question is, Neil, thank you for being here. Are you at all critical at any aspect of U.S. foreign policy, or is it all a white knight in shining armor defending democracy all over the world?
And they're hiring, but not you.
On the contrary, I'm always attracted to people who quarrel and disagree with me. In fact, I incentivize students and colleagues to disagree with me. I'll try and be succinct as, and please do come and join us. The weather is somewhat better, certainly warmer than it is here.
Whatever do you mean?
So let me start with Leah's question. It's lovely to see you, Leah. You brought me to Vancouver, 10 years ago now. Time flies, and it's great to see you again. The good news is that there are cases of successful transformation, and in some ways they're relevant to Ukraine, since it's already been mentioned. I've said to President Zelensky, I said it in September 2022, you've got to think of your fate as being, we're either South Korea or we're South Vietnam, and you want to be South Korea. South Korea is the great success story in many ways of the Cold War. Because if you think about its situation at the end of the Korean War in 1953, it was a shattered wreck of a country. It had a legacy of Japanese imperialism. It had an authoritarian system of government in the period after the Korean War. And yet, South Korea showed, perhaps more than any other country in the Cold War, the benefits of a free society and a free market. And it's fascinating to watch the way that transition happened. The rapid recovery from the war, with the mirror image in North Korea of a completely stagnant, unfree society, and then a successful transition to democracy. It's a story we don't think enough about, but when you consider the odds, they were against success. They had this incredibly dangerous frontier with this extremely hostile northern neighbor that was constantly threatening them, and yet it worked. And I think it's the example that not only Ukraine needs to look to, but soon I think Venezuela will need to look to. How do you rebuild a destroyed society? The great news is we have answers to that. The problem that we have in countries like Canada and the United Kingdom is our problems aren't bad enough yet to motivate us to the kind of radical reforms that we see in Argentina today. I hope we don't have to go to the brink of hyperinflation, which they did in Argentina, to focus our minds on the need for radical reform. It would be great if we could avoid that extraordinarily painful path. Maximus, apologies, I think Maximus is a better name. Do you have a little brother called Minimus?
First initial D.
I'm really sorry that the baby boomers screwed things up. I did my best to warn my contemporaries against this. In a book called The Cash Nexus that was published 25 years ago, I said, in the 21st century, the conflicts are going to be between generations, not between classes, not between ethnic groups. And we are embarking on a course that will lead to generational conflict. And I think I was vindicated by that. I have stood up for your generation. I've also contributed to it, as I have 5 children. And so they're kind of with you. I indeed have a son who's just about to turn 14 who asks me questions like the one you asked me. What should I do in a world in which AI seems poised to take the jobs and in which the baby boomers have saddled us with unfinanceable debts? Dad, what should I do? And my answer is read. Just read more books than your contemporaries. Read every day, read in bed every night. Don't watch television. Don't play video games. Don't have a smartphone. Just read. That's it. And finally, to my academic colleague who wants to join us, our happy band in Austin, I pride myself in the fact that I have been consistently ambivalent about President Trump for 10 years. And you can track this in my journalism. I've tried to be fair, because it's not all bad, though it's not all good. I was very critical about the Liberation Day tariffs in April. They very nearly caused a financial crisis. And if they hadn't postponed them, I hate to think what would have happened on April the 9th. Things were extremely close to crisis point in financial markets at that point. I have been skeptical of the idea that there's a reverse Nixon strategy, that you can somehow pull Putin away from Xi Jinping, which I think is the underlying thesis behind the Ukraine peace initiative. It can't be understood in its own terms. It's part of a grand strategy to try to drive a wedge between Russia and China. And this is the Nixonian piece that I mentioned right at the beginning. The influence of Nixon on Trump is much greater than people appreciate. The reason that you Canadians are smarting is the same reason that you were smarting in 1971, when Nixon administered the Nixon shock. And Canada, I mean, I know this because I've been reading the correspondence of Pierre Trudeau. Canada was absolutely aghast when Nixon imposed a 10% tariff and devalued the dollar in 71. So I've been critical of a number of aspects of Trump's policy. But if one takes a step back and asks, what's the right approach to the kind of problems that I talked about earlier on this evening? What's the way to make the United States strong again? Because I think that's the key. If the United States is not strong, what we do in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, it's a rounding error. It doesn't matter. If the US fails, it's game over, thanks for playing. So does Trump have a coherent strategy to make the United States great, or at least strong again? I would say more coherent than the Democrats had, because the Democrats' strategy was one of self-destruction. Is it perfect? No. Have the tariffs been as damaging as all those Nobel laureates predicted last year? No. In fact, if I had an economics degree, I want my money back, because every single economist that I know of, and all the ones with Nobel Prizes, assured us that if Trump imposed tariffs at the rates of the 1930s, there would be at least a recession and a stock market crash and probably a depression, and here we are. So I think the economics of Trumpism thus far have defied the economists. The grand strategy, to my mind, has delivered success in the Middle East. You know, the Iranians, not enjoying life quite the way they were during the Biden administration. I think we'll see what comes of the Russia-Ukraine peace. I think it's highly likely that Putin in the end just decides to keep fighting and walks away from the compromise peace. That's my worry. But the grand strategy isn't at this point a failure. It remains to be seen whether he gets the better of Xi Jinping. That is the big one. The big question to which no one knows the answer is what happens in the Taiwan crisis of 2027. I think it's coming. I think it comes in some shape or form in the next 3 years. I don't think it's an invasion. I don't think it's a blockade. But I think Xi Jinping pops the question about Taiwan at some point on Trump's watch. And that will be the decisive moment. Let me end with this observation, because it's time to go and have a drink. I've only had one quite meager bourbon so far this evening, which for a Glaswegian is you know, it's close to cold turkey. So let me conclude with this observation. The historical process is not deterministic. It's a highly complex system with contingency and chaos, nonlinear outcomes that no one can predict. No one knows when the next natural disaster will strike. That's what makes history a process too complex to model. So we can't know at this moment in time, the beginning of December 2025, if, as in the first Cold War, the West wins because free institutions and free societies are more innovative and more resilient than unfree ones. That's my broad bet. That's the bet of my career. that ultimately the pathologies of the Chinese, Iranian, Russian, and North Korean systems will be fatal to them. We can't be certain, though. We can't be certain that the Chinese system will break down before Xi has played his most risky card. He's going to play that card soon because he knows that in the long run, he loses. In the long run, the demographics, the debt dynamics, the inevitable deflationary slowdown get the CCP. At the core, the system's not different from the Soviet system. It just has a market economy wrapped around it, but at the core, it's the same. It's corrupt, unaccountable, one-party rule. That cannot work over the long run, and he knows that. But he might just do what all the authoritarians attempted to do, gamble on a bold stroke, hope that the United States is bluffing, hope that Trump himself is a kind of false savior. That's what I worry about. Not the long run trajectories. I think in the long run, free societies prevail. But my nightmare is a short run contingency in which we are confronted with the choice between World War III or capitulation. That's the nightmare scenario. I'm more optimistic than you were in the polling. I think the advantages lie with the West and our capacity for rejuvenation, for revitalizing ourselves. We should never underestimate that. And I've seen it for my own eyes. It's real. Maximus's generation, they, if we only let them, can address these problems. But we must be aware of the profound threat that we face from that axis of ill will. I've always found that fear is a great source of motivation. I was certainly very afraid for much of my youth, afraid of failure, afraid of doing badly in exams, afraid of ferocious schoolmasters. And you know, that's good. You got to have a little bit of fear to motivate you. So I want to put some fear in you. I want you to be afraid of defeat. Be afraid of unfreedom. With that little bit of fear, you might just get up tomorrow morning with a little bit more resolve to fix the existing institutions. And if you can't do that, do what we've done. Create new ones. Thanks very much.